we have arrived at the Yoga Sutras in our exploration of the vastness of yogic literature and tradition. We've come to the place that's probably the most popular yoga book in America. And any yoga teacher training, any reputable yoga teacher training in America is generally referencing this book, and some of them, this is the main book, the main kind of ancient yogic text. And it's interesting because this text doesn't mention, it mentions the word asana once, and it mentions pranayama a few times, twice maybe. And otherwise it has nothing really to do with what you think of what people think of when they talk about yoga today. And part of this issue, part of how this came about, has to do with a person named Pattabhi Jois, who was a student of Krishnamacharya, who basically invented what we understand as modern yoga. He taught Iyengar. I don't know if these are names that are familiar to you, but Iyengar Yoga was created by BKS Iyengar, who was taught by Krishnamacharya. He was his nephew. Pattabhi Jois was taught by Krishnamacharya. Desikachar, who created Vinaya Yoga, was taught by Krishnamacharya. There's a Western woman whose name I don't remember right now, who was taught by Krishnamacharya and developed a yoga lineage based on the West Coast. And actually, if you think about, you walk into a yoga studio and the vinyasa class, that the format and the structure of the vinyasa class was basically derived from Pattabhi Jois's style of yoga. Iyengar was kind of doing a different thing, especially later on, with more focus on alignment and kind of precision of postures, staying in postures for a long time. Pattabhi Jois was developing this fluid movement from posture to posture, sequences. And if you've heard of Ashtanga Yoga, that's the style of yoga. That's what he called it. He called his style of yoga Ashtanga Yoga. Assumedly, supposedly, because in the Yoga Sutra, there is a description of what's called Ashtanga Yoga. Ashta, 8, Anga, limbs. 8 limbs of yoga. So Pattabhi Jois, and there's, people who say that the reason he did it was because he was teaching a new thing and he wanted to link it to an old thing. Well, whether that was his idea or not, we can certainly see that in the modern yoga world. People teaching a new thing and wanting to call it something old, wanting to somehow link it to this tradition of yoga that goes back thousands of years, even though the actual linkage, what they're teaching, is a little bit shaky. So what Pattabhi Jois was teaching was not the Yoga Sutras, but he called his style of yoga. And that's not to say there weren't Yoga Sutra classes going on at Pattabhi Jois's Yoga Shala. It's that the style of yoga called Ashtanga Yoga that you see all around today is named after a phrase in the Yoga Sutras that has nothing really to do with the style of the Surya A sequence, Surya B sequence, the expression, the manifestation that you see. And that has left this awkward situation where the yoga, Krishnamacharya himself and Iyengar and Pattabhi Jois, and even before them, Vivekananda, who came and spoke at the Parliament of World Religions at the end of the 19th century in Chicago as the first representative really of yoga in the West, they all kind of zeroed in on the Yoga Sutras, which were kind of, at that point in India, a fairly obscure text. People weren't really writing commentaries on them or translating them much. There were sects, there were traditions, lineages that were using the Yoga Sutras as their central text, but in general, most people didn't really know about it. And the Yoga Sutras, there was a kind of period where they were being translated into other languages about 1,000 years ago. But it had been several hundred years before really anybody throughout the world or throughout India writ large was talking about the Yoga Sutras, before Vivekananda and then Krishnamacharya and his students brought it back. And it is in some ways, if you think about the 8 limbs as they are, they're fairly accessible. And a lot of, as we discussed last week, a lot of the texts, and especially when you're thinking about Sankhya philosophy, which is what we were dipping into last week, it's kind of obscure and complex. The symbolic nature of the Vedas themselves, the Upanishads and all the symbology there. The Ramayana is a story. How does that, so it's a little bit more tactile, tangible. But the thing is, we're only talking about a few verses, a few sutras of the Yoga Sutra when we talk about the Ashtanga, the 8 limbs, Ashtanga. And then also there's a little bit about Kriya Yoga, which has 3 limbs. That's a portion of the second book out of 4 books of the Yoga Sutra. And so, what I would like to do is give you a more broad experience overview of the Yoga Sutra rather than just talking about the 8 limbs. You may have heard of the 8 limbs, you may not have heard of them. I described them in the Yoga Philosophy Handbook, so if you want to dig more into it, I recommend you check that out. And then also there's many translations and commentaries on the Yoga Sutra that are available. The best one that I think is this one by Nikolai Bachman. So this is if you're gonna go for it, it's a little bit more expensive probably. It comes with CDs, which maybe it doesn't anymore. There must be a way now they sell it without the CDs because nobody uses CDs anymore. It's not because of, you can listen to him chanting them and everything, but he really breaks it down in a way that's meaningful. There's some versions that don't even have the Sanskrit, and it's just a translation. And you know how I feel about translations, everybody's translation is different. And so you're getting it just through that person's lens. So anyway, if you want to dive into one aspect of the Yoga Sutras after we've had this overview, please do. And I'm going to structure this talk a little bit around 3 aspects, 3 things that are spoken about in the Yoga Sutra. One is, who am I? So what's the basis? Where are we starting from? Who am I? What is a human person? What is reality? And then what is yoga practice? What is the path of yoga, let's say? So beyond just the practice of yoga, what is the path of yoga? And then what are the results of the path of yoga? What are the results of, walking on this path? So these are 3 things that are very clearly articulated in some depth in the Yoga Sutra. Before that, I'll just say that the Yoga Sutra, it came out of a time. So we talked about the Vedas and we talked about the Upanishads and the Ramayana and Sankhya. And I spoke a little bit last week in the talk about Sankhya about how there was this group of people that left society, kind of a movement of seekers who left society to go and try to rediscover, re-encounter the roots, the depth, the inner message of the Vedas that had been kind of wrapped up into ritual. And there was this priestly caste that had kind of absorbed all this and turned it into this kind of ritualistic structure, kind of like what happened with the Catholic Church in the West. And so these group of seekers called Shramanas went off and they formed ashrams and they went in and sought the truth. And in that there was a rebellion against the Brahmanical culture and the culture of this Vedic ritualism. And so during this time, this is when Buddhism arose. This is when Sankhya philosophy arose. This is when Jainism arose. So there's all these different threads. And Buddhism doesn't become a religion until it becomes a religion. Before it's a religion, it's a person who's teaching something, bringing through a teaching. and Jainism doesn't become a religion until, religion is a fortification, or in some ways a solidification of a dynamic fluid teaching that's coming through a person. So this is a time of expansion of ideas, arguments. Buddhists are writing against Vedic or Brahmanical texts. The Brahmins are writing against the Buddhist texts. There's a lot of kind of textual arguments going on. At this time, it turns out that no Buddhists wrote negatively about the Yoga Sutra, and that has led some scholars to assume that the Yoga Sutra may have been a Buddhist text. The places that it appears in its earliest forms are just the first 3 books. And the style, this kind of very tight sutra style, was common with the Buddhists at that time. So there's some question about whether this text actually came out of a Buddhist school, and then the 4th book was added to contextualize it within the Vedic Brahmanical tradition. It's like the Brahmins then were trying to kind of bring this wisdom back into their religious. And you have to remember, when I'm talking about this, these are social structures. Religion in a way becomes like a social, intellectual, cultural structure. The teaching, the truth that's being conveyed is something different. It is what it is. These are just the frameworks that it's moving through. And so the Brahman, so that's one theory possibly, is that, this text came about, the 4th book was added, and then there's also a commentary by an author who's called Vyas. The commentary is called the Bhashya, which basically means commentary. And Vyas is the name of the person who compiled the Vedas and the Mahabharata and all the major, the Upanishads, all that stuff. So Vyas is kind of like, it probably wasn't the same Vyas, although in the kind of cultural tradition, they consider him to be the one who did all this. There's some question as to whether Vyas was, again, reinterpreting the Yoga Sutra in a kind of Brahmanical context. So there's all these kind of sub layers going on here, and there's conversations going on, and also nobody really knows now nobody knows who Patanjali actually was. I mean, I say nobody I've met, nobody that I know of. There may be some traditions in India that know of Patanjali, but there's a little bit at the beginning of what I wrote in the philosophy manual, just about this dynamic between people claiming Patanjali. Oh, I know who Patanjali was. He was this guy who did this thing. And then the kind of more nuanced, what the actual historical record shows, which is a little more complicated. So this is the space, this kind of space of cutting edge exploration, conversation, commentary, argument, that the Yoga Sutras are born into. And they're in a way a summary of different ashrams' experiences and explorations. It's kind of like, okay, this is what we've got. This is what's going on out there. It's kind of, here's the state of the the broad exploration, kind of compiled into this text in the sutra form. And it's based on, so we talked about Sankhya philosophy last week, it's basically based on, like, philosophically, intellectually, the understanding of things is based on the same thing, the tattvas, this innate separation of Purusha and Prakriti, the elements of reality, the ahankar, the ego, the buddhi, the kind of higher wisdom, the elements, all that stuff from the Sankhya philosophy is assumed and articulated in the Yoga Sutras. So that's why I said last week, in order to really understand the Yoga Sutras, you have to have some basis of understanding of Sankhya. The Yoga Sutras were speaking to a specific audience at a specific time in a specific environment. And these people were serious, mostly. Well, I shouldn't use that word in a kind of sensationalist way. They weren't householders. They had left society. They had devoted their lives to exploring the inner dimensions of consciousness and seeking to understand who they were. So that's where the Yoga Sutras is a compilation of their work and also speaking to that audience. And I think in a way, there's been a lot of efforts because of the popularity of the Yoga Sutras. There's been a lot of effort to kind of recontextualize it for a modern audience, which is useful and good, and also sometimes a little sketchy because of the same thing that I was mentioning about Patabi Joyce. People have an agenda that's not spoken often about validating their modern work by tying it to something old. And that agenda, sometimes the message just gets a little mixed up with that agenda. So it's important when you're reading translations and hearing people talk about the Yoga Sutras to kind of just vibe out what's going on as far as what they're saying and what their motivations might be. And I think that's enough of a preamble for now. So I'll just talk a little bit about these three questions or three areas of inquiry that the Yoga Sutras dive into. Who am I? What is the path of yoga? And what are the results of walking along the path of yoga? And this is not meant to be theoretical. I mean, even in the context of the Yoga Sutras, it's not meant to be theoretical. It's not meant to be conceptual. This is real life stuff. This is who am I for real? And I'd like to invite you just to explore that. When I talk about the context or the teaching of the Yoga Sutra about who am I, try to feel into that because it's quite specific. Basically what the Yoga Sutra says, and this is, as I said, resonates with Sankhya. The forces of nature, Prakriti, flow into the container of ahankar, into the container of I amness, individuality, right? So the Prakriti, the essential stuff of existence, which I'll call the forces of nature, pour themselves into this individuation that is the sense of I-ness, ahankar. So that's me, that's you. We're in this container of I. Ahankar means the I maker, that which creates the experience of I. And it's anchored into that individuation by the fear of death, the desire to keep living. This is a fundamental aspect of my being. I experience myself as an individual and I don't want to die. And that is, all life has that. It's how life stays alive. It's how life keeps going. And that we can say fear of death, and we could also say the joy of living. It's kind of looked at from two different directions, but it's the same thing. Abhinivesha, the desire to keep living. So that's the anchor that holds the individuality in place in life. And then the individual, me, you, us, we act in ways that produce karma. So we begin to act in the world and interact. And when we act, we produce karma, and that karma is positive, negative, or neutral. They say black, white, or in between. So I might do something, and of course everything's relative, but positive meaning fruitful, brings me in the direction of self-realization. I mean, one other thing that the Yoga Sutra says is that all this that I just described exists for two purposes: enjoyment and liberation. Enjoyment of the Purusha. That's not enjoyment of like sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Not enjoyment of the ego. Enjoyment of the Purusha, enjoyment of the soul, because you have to remember there's the forces of nature are bringing all this in, but there's the Purusha is behind and eternally free. It doesn't, even when it's observing the thoughts. So we have our, we call it chitta. Chitta is basically buddhi, ahankara, and manas. It's the collection of the inner being, the heart mind, the inner self, your thoughts, your sense of self, your dreams, your aspirations, your fears, your beliefs about reality. All that is tied up inside the heart mind, the chitta. So the soul, we'll call the Purusha the soul, just for simplicity's sake. The soul, which is you. This is not a theory, right? This is not an idea. You vast, undifferentiated, perfect, like eternal, fearless. It's there, it's you. It's looking through the chitta. It has projected the chitta, it has projected this heart mind, this individuated being into existence through seeing. It has seen it into existence, and then it sees through it the rest of the universe, the rest of the cosmos. All elements, all stuff. That seer does not change when it sees stuff. So it is still right now. It's not something to become. It already is. It's not going to get better. It's not going to get worse. It just is itself. Perfect, clear, pure, radiant, eternal. It's looking through this chitta, this intermediate layer that we mostly identify as self. And this intermediate layer gets confused. It gets confused. Samyoga gets confused and thinks this is me. Really, the Purusha is me, but it thinks that this is me, this stuff. And it also gets all kind of mixed up with impurities. So it's like a window. The Purusha is looking through the window, but the window's got stuff all over it. So it sees everything distortedly. It sees, and it becomes confused. We become confused about who am I? This is basically the milieu of the human person, right? This kind of identification of the seer and the seen. We get confused that the seer, Purusha, gets confused with the seen, Chitta. So when we experience, we feel into who am I? Who am I? What am I? Mostly what we feel is beliefs, thoughts, ideas, likes, dislikes, preferences, fears, hungers, desires, aspirations. We feel that collection. That's me. That's the confusion. We have confused me with that stuff when what me really is absolutely free and eternal. And so that confusion of the seer and seen produces suffering, dukkha. We talked about dukkha last week, suffering through ignorance, right? So that's the confusion of the seer and the seen produces suffering. And then the Yoga Sutra says suffering is avoidable. Heya, suffering is avoidable. So the whole process of yoga is kind of unwinding all that confusion, the entanglement. So what the entanglement produces is karma, and the karma ripples out and ripples back, and the karma produces what's called sanskaras or vasanas, these seeds that travel from lifetime to lifetime. So I do an act, and basically all this whole karma thing, as we talked about before, the purpose of it is liberation, enjoyment of the Purusha and liberation. The words are bhoga and moksha, enjoyment of the Purusha and liberation. And so all the karma is also for the purpose of liberation. So anytime I act in a way that demonstrates my confusion, the cosmos is set up in a way that action is going to come back to me and say, look, you're confused. That's karma. Karma is the message that says, hey, look, you're confused. And over many, many lifetimes, eventually, we learn progressively, breath after breath, day after day, year after year, lifetime after lifetime. We learn. And we learn whether we're on the path of yoga or not. But the path of yoga is we're learning, and we say, okay, I'm in it. I really want to know. I want to know. I want to give myself to this exploration. The other thing that this samyoga, this confusion produces within the chitta is what is called in the Yoga Sutra vrittis. Now, vritti has the sense of like functioning, but it's kind of like a swirl. Even the word itself is like vritti. It's like sounds kind of like a swirling. And at the beginning of the Yoga Sutras, I don't know if you heard it in the song that was playing when we came on, Yoga's chitta vritti nirodha. Yoga is the cessation, the stopping, the stillness of the vrittis in the chitta, of the spinning, of the functioning of the mind. It's stilling. It's, nirodha, stilling. And the sutra talks about 5 types of vrittis. You can explore that. There's also limitations, antarayas, like things that get in the way of our exploration. Disease, apathy, doubt, carelessness, lethargy. These are kind of parts of human existence, things that we have to deal with. Temptation, erroneous views, ungroundedness, regression, negativity, agitation. The Yoga Sutra kind of lists these all out. Like, this is part of the field here, folks. These are the things that you're going to have to deal with. And you deal with them through the practice of yoga. And there's some specific recommendations for how to deal with these things. And there's also another part of the field is the kleshas, the forms of suffering, basically, pains, ignorance, clinging to pleasure, clinging to pain, clinging to suffering, fear of death. These are part of the field. And, there's this, it's like, I'm bringing this all in the who am I section, because it's like, yes, it's all well and good for me to say to you, you are the soul. Just, okay, ready? Feel it. Feel yourself as a soul and be free. But like all this other stuff is in the field and you didn't do that. It's not your fault. It's not your fault that you have limitations. It's not your fault that you cling to pleasure, or that you cling to suffering, or that you are afraid of dying, or that, this is part of the picture here. This is what we're working with. And if we can just kind of get rid of like shame and self-negation and all that kind of like, it's my fault that I'm so stuck and I can't progress and this path of yoga is so hard and that isn't, it's like you were brought here, you agreed to be in this milieu, it's not your fault, you didn't do it. And every moment is a free moment. Every moment is the function of karma means that everything that you ever did and experienced in your past is completely here right now. So there is no, every moment is an opportunity to resolve and move forward. There's nothing to be ashamed of. There's nothing to be, to not forgive yourself about, because it can all be resolved right now. The last thing I'll mention about the self is the karmashaya. The karmashaya is the storehouse of karma. So, I mentioned that there's this kind of force of karma that is kind of always redirecting us towards the truth of who we are. The karma is the place that the Yoga Sutra names the place where these karmas are. So it's like the karma shed. It's like the karma barn, where this is an aspect of you, of your being. Is this karma shed that you're dragging around, and it's and that's where the sanskaras, the seeds of karma, let's just say, live. They're stored in the karmashaya. So that's not a total overview, but that's pretty basic overview of the stage, the scene that the Yoga Sutra paints of the individual being. And I just want to say quickly that I'm not going in order here of book 1, book 2, book 3, book 4, partially because it's a little curious why the sutras are in the order that they are in. And secondly, because my purpose here is I basically drew out all the parts that talk about who am I first, and then we're going to go into the path of yoga second. So I'm pulling from a lot of this stuff's in the 4th book, and some of it's in the 1st book. The path of yoga. Yoga practice, yoga engagement with yoga, involvement with yoga, removes resistance to the natural flow of forces. So the natural flow of forces is towards liberation, is towards discernment, towards recognizing the truth of who you are. That's the organic, natural flow. You imagine water in a field, it wants to run downhill. So what does a farmer do when they want to capture that water or they want to channel it in a certain direction? They just reshape the field. And this is actually the analogy that's used in the Yoga Sutras. Like, you know, the natural flow of things is toward awakening, toward liberation, toward realization. And so the farmer shapes the field to make the water go where they want it to. And the path of yoga, the yogi, shapes the field so that things can flow most naturally and organically. Removing the obstacles to the flow of water irrigates the fields and also opens up the path of yoga. And the path of yoga is characterized by two major elements, and according to the Yoga Sutra: abhyasa, practice, diligent, consistent practice, and vairagya, dispassion. Raga is a kind of attachment, desire, craving. So vairagya is like, separation from, rejection of, craving, desire, clinging. So diligent, consistent practice over time, and vairagya, dispassion, say, lead to nirodha, the cessation, the stillness, the tranquility of the functioning of the mind. And I think, most of us have had experiences where the mind is still, or you could at least imagine, what would it be like if my mind was still like the sky, still like the open blue sky on a cloudless day? What would it be like for the mind to be like that? And we know the alternative, when the mind is filled with all kinds of activity and being pulled in a million directions, and this thought and that thought. And then there's the openness. So this is nirodha, this stillness. The stillness like on a lake or a pond, when the water is totally tranquil, no ripples. So abhyasa and vairagya, over time, with intention, with consistency, with eagerness and sincerity, lead to this stilling. And the 8 limbs specifically break down a process leading to that state of stillness, which they call samadhi. But before we get there, I just want to say that there's, within the path of yoga, within the kind of structures of the path of yoga, so abhyasa and vairagya are kind of overarching principles, like practice and dispassion, overarching principles. And then there's 3 different things that are mentioned. And as far as like, how do you get to that state of nirodha, of samadhi, of stillness, of kind of union, experienced, realized union with all that is, in a way that is clear and consistent and seamless and still? How do you get there? The first thing is Ishvara Pranidhana. Just give everything to the divine. And this verse comes up in a very interesting way. It's kind of saying you can do abhyasa and vairagya. I mean, it's almost seems like an alternative to abhyasa and vairagya. It's almost like you can do abhyasa and vairagya and you can be intensely involved. There's all these different ways you can practice. And the word is Ishvara Pranidhana Va. It's one word, this sutra, one word, Ishvara Pranidhana Va. Va means or. So it's like, or give everything to Ishvara. And then it says who Ishvara is. Ishvara is a different kind of Purusha that doesn't have all this karma stuff going on. Ishvara is the timeless, eternal wisdom of the cosmos. Ishvara is the pranava, the Om. So it's saying instead of the intentional practice, you can also completely surrender everything. Pranidhana is like give it all over, lay it down at the foot of Ishvara. The word Ishvara has the sense of Lord, the Lord of yoga. And there's some teachers or kind of translators who will translate the word in an impersonal sense, like, the wisdom of the universe or some kind of conceptual thing. But Ishvara is not a vague word. It's a person. I mean, it's what the word was used at that time to talk about a person. So it's a personified being of the divine, of that which holds all the wisdom of yoga and is not influenced by all the limitations, the kleshas, the antarayas, the limitations and the difficulties and all the stuff that we are beset by and all the karmic entanglements. Ishvara is not dealing with all that. And so Ishvara is clear. And so by surrendering, offering oneself, laying everything down at the feet of Ishvara, we partake of that wisdom. We're blessed by that wisdom. We receive that wisdom. It's quite striking. I mean, this is in the kind of the beginning of the second half of the first book. And there's a good chunk of the Yoga Sutras dedicated to, okay, what do we mean here? What is Ishvara and what is surrender to Ishvara? And it goes into kind of chanting of Om. What is this pranava, chanting of Om, that by chanting this syllable, this Om, you receive the benefits. You are put in touch with this Ishvara. You understand and learn about, in an embodied way, this being to whom you are invited to surrender. So we have, I said before, Abhyasa and Vairagya are overarching, but I mean, the way I read it is there's like Abhyasa and Vairagya or Ishvara Pranidhana. Of course, it doesn't have to be or, but that's kind of the way it's framed. And then there's Kriya Yoga. So Abhyasa and Vairagya, kind of under the container of practice and dispassion. If you're going to be on a yoga path that's active and engaged, Kriya is like active yoga, like intentional, engaged, active yoga. And it's tapas, svadhyaya, and Ishvara Pranidhana. So Ishvara Pranidhana comes back in here under Kriya Yoga. Tapas is heat, intention, aspiration, fire, the flame of practice, the flame of intention, the flame of consistency, the kind of steady flame that burns up impurities. And one of the things about the Yoga Sutra is there's several different words for purification, shuddhi, prasadam, that show up in the Yoga Sutra in different contexts. It's very clear that what the Yoga Sutra is talking about is purifying the chitta. So that's the purpose of yoga, and that's where the path is taking us, is through purification of the chitta. And that happens through tapas, the heat, the fire of our practice, of our intentionality. And svadhyaya is like self-study. But in the Pashya, in the commentary, specifically they say self-study is chanting Om and reading scriptures. The word svadhyaya has the kind of sense of self, which is like studying, getting to know oneself. So I like that as a translation, even though the commentary specifically says that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about studying the scriptures. And so Kriya Yoga, again, includes these three aspects. Heat, tapas, intention, aspiration, the flame of aspiration, ardor. It's like going through hard stuff. Some people translate tapas as the willingness to go through pain. So difficulty, bearing, every time you go through something difficult, it shapes you. And especially if you go through it with a sense of trust, surrender, acceptance, if we can stay steady in the center when difficult things are going on and not get pulled in a million directions emotionally, purification happens. There's a reorienting of our inner landscape. It's very hard to do, to stay steady. when you're angry, when you're terrified, when you're sad, to stay clear and steady. But that's the tapas, comes from the heat of moving through those experiences. Staying with self-study and surrender to the divine. This is Kriya Yoga. This is kind of, and again, I kind of see the Yoga Sutras as a survey of the landscape. It's kind of like there's Abhyasa and Vairagya, there's Ishvara Pranidhan. Some people are doing this Kriya Yoga, tapas, like this is what those people do. And the 8 limbs, this is what, it's like different, it's got all these different elements. It's not necessarily saying like your practice has to incorporate all of these things. It's saying the path of yoga, these are different ways that people are exploring the path of yoga. At least that's how I read it. It also says when we experience disturbing thoughts, we should take the other attitude. We should change the way we're thinking about things. We should make it, in our minds, we take responsibility for the content of our minds. So when our minds are feeding us disturbing, fearful, or aggressive, resentful, angry, craving thoughts, it's our responsibility to do something about that, to intentionally shift our inner landscape. And then we come to the 8 limbs. So this is kind of the last piece about, what is the path of yoga, is these 8 limbs of yoga. And this is, maybe the most, if you think about yoga philosophy, the 8 limbs of yoga are the most probably popular manifestation of yoga philosophy in the West today. And part of that is because they're straightforward and they're pretty comprehensive. It starts with the outermost aspect. So the first limb is the yama, and it's the outermost, it has to do with us in relationship with society. How do we treat other people? How do we engage in society? And specifically, the yamas, the Yoga Sutras goes through each one and says, if you do this, if you're firm in ahimsa, let's say, if you're practicing firmly ahimsa, steady with it, then what's going to happen is, and ahimsa is nonviolence, what's going to happen is hostility is going to stop being an issue for you. There's not going to be hostility around you if you practice nonviolence. And this is not nonviolence in some kind of like rigid intellectual way. This is nonviolence as an embodiment. So it's not thinking violent thoughts. It's not, it's the noticing that there's a violent thought coming or a violent emotion and redirecting it, just like the farmer in the fields, redirecting the flow, redirecting. So we get to a place, and everything in this yoga is about progress and development over time. So it's not like you should be somewhere. There's never a should be somewhere. It's like everything is progressive. You are where you are, and you're in a process that is always leading forward. And so the process of, wherever I am right now when it comes to nonviolence, the practice of yoga, the intentional cultivation of yoga is, okay, how can I become more aligned with nonviolence? I might not smack people, but I might think mean things about them. I might wish I could smack them. Okay, so that's the next thing. So then that eventually gets clarified. I might not wish I could smack them, but I might unintentionally fantasize about, I might have dreams about smacking them. So it's like it's more subtle, more subtle, more subtle. And eventually, then one becomes aligned in an inner way with ahimsa, nonviolence. And the other limb, satya, truthfulness. It's the same thing. When practicing truthfulness, the results of your action are sure. Because there's no falsehood in the way. There's no pretension. There's no, you're not telling stories. And truthfulness, again, there's outer truthfulness. There's actually what you speak. Then there's what you think, the lies you tell yourself, the lies, the lies that you don't even know you're telling yourself, so subtle, 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 subtle. The yamas are the outermost. Again, I really invite you, study these. My purpose right now is not for you to memorize the names of the yamas and what they all are. My purpose is really to introduce you to the Yoga Sutra writ large, so that as you explore it on your own, you can kind of enter into relationship with it in a more holistic way. So I'm not going to go through each of the yamas and the niyamas, but let's just, yamas, the first thing is our relationship with, and yama has to do with restraint. Just like, so it's very clear here. The Yoga Sutras isn't about, it's like, we tend to want to do things that are not useful. And what we're going to do now is we're going to restrain ourselves and not do them. It's not a kind of, let's, allow all of our impulses to express themselves. There is a framework of restraint and containment. The niyamas have to do with the same thing, containment and restraint, when it comes to our inner relationship, to ourself. So outer is the yamas, outer restraints in our relationship to people, non-violence, truthfulness, non-stealing, containment of our sexual energy, and non-greed, non-hoarding, non-possessiveness, right? That's our relationship to outside. Then there's our relationship to ourselves, saucha, like cleanliness, contentedness, happiness. Tapas comes back in here, right? So cultivation of the inner fire, cultivation of the aspiration towards self-realization. Svadhyaya comes back here, and Ishvara Pranidhana. So these three, tapas, svadhyaya, and Ishvara Pranidhana, again, they're in the Kriya Yoga, and they're here too, because these, I think, these are two different frameworks embedded within each other. It's like a survey. These people are doing this. Here's some different ways to approach it. So there's all this kind of embeddedness. Don't get confused or entangled in that. Yama, outside, niyama, how I relate to myself. And then it says, okay, now sit down. Stira Sukha Asanam. Sit in a comfortable, steady, balanced seat. This is the mention of the word asana. It doesn't say, now do pigeon pose. It says, sit down. Okay? So we've now talked about how we're going to contain and organize our relationship to the outer world. Then we're going to contain and organize our relationship to ourselves. And then we're going to sit down in a steady, comfortable sukha, right? Contented, comfortable, pleasant, steady seat, balanced. And then it says specifically that when we can sit in this way, we become invulnerable to the pull of duality, happy, sad, up, down, angry, all these dual things that we're pulled at. So it's really clear that what they're talking about here, what Patanjali is talking about, is stillness, centeredness, physically seated, but also seated in oneself in a way that is balanced and that is not leaning in one direction or another and being pulled by the dual nature of reality. Proactive, relaxed joining of the self. And then once you sit down, then you begin to pranayama. Yama, again, we have the word yama, pranayama, restrain the breath. And it specifically says what we're doing is we're cutting off the movement of the inhale and the exhale. So we think of pranayama as all these exercises, working with the prana, right? Pranayama, in the context of the Yoga Sutra, the word is vicheda, cutting off the flow of the inhale and the exhale for a long time. Dirga Sukshma, for a long time. And it basically says that the vrittis will respond to this, that you'll be able to observe the reaction of the vrittis to the cutting off of the breath. And this is, you can't imagine that it's like, okay, now sit down and hold your breath forever or something. It's like there's a development of the capacity to manage the breathing mechanism.
And like what we did today with exploring bandhas and kumbhaka.
I mean, see, the thing is, as soon as we start talking about bandhas and kumbhaka and these practices, the Yoga Sutra doesn't say anything about these things.
Right.
We can say that they're implied in there. We can say that, but there's no text that introduces this kind of practices in pranayama for another 1,000 years after the Yoga Sutra was written. So I don't think we can assume that the Yoga Sutra was saying bandhas and these things. This is what we're doing now as far as pranayama. But the Yoga Sutra just says, sit down and stop breathing. Really? It doesn't say how to get there. It doesn't say, there's no elaboration at all. Sit down and stop breathing. And then control your breath. I mean, this word vicheda, it doesn't necessarily mean stop. So we'll give you that. Control your breathing. Sit down and control your breathing. And we definitely hear stories of yogis, and throughout India, there's stories of yogis who, sit and don't breathe, lock themselves in a cave, bury themselves underground for 10 years, and then come back out afterwards. So there's that sense that that's part of the process. But again, in the Yoga Sutra, there's no elaboration whatsoever about what pranayama techniques might look like. After pranayama, the next inward, so you sit down, then we regulate the breath, control the breath, pranayama. So let's just say control the breath. And then pratyahara, look inside. So there's this whole, and I should also say, in some ways, the Yoga Sutras, it is combining the wisdom and the experiences of the Shramanas with the Upanishadic wisdom, with the wisdom of the Upanishads. I mentioned in the Upanishads that there's in several Upanishads, they talk about on the Katha specifically, they talk about the indriyas, the senses being outward. We're drawn outward by our senses. So this is, okay, bring it in. Stop looking outside. Stop hearing. Stop listening. Stop feeling with your skin. Stop, close your eyes. All the senses that are drawing you out, we're going to cut them off and we're going to redirect them inside. And these are the first 5 limbs, and these are the outer limbs, and they prepare you for the 3 inner limbs. So yama, niyama have to do with engagement out there. Then you sit down, pranayama, control the breath, pratyahara, so you're not being distracted. You're not just following what's going on out there. You're focused inside, and now you're ready for dharana. And the last 3 limbs are grouped together and called samyama. So the total restraint. Samyama basically means, we have the word yama many times here. Samyama is like restraining everything. So we're restraining our actions, we're restraining our relationship to ourselves, we're restraining our motion, we're sitting still, we're restraining our breath, and we're restraining our senses. That prepares us for samyama, for restraining everything else, which is the entire internal situation. Dharana is concentration. So we're focusing our attention on one thing. That's dharana, that's meditation, basically, concentration. Well, let's say that's concentration. Dhyan is meditation, and that is when that focus becomes consistent and uninterrupted over time. So let's say it's a candle flame in front of you. You're focused on it, one thing. Then that focus, so then you're focused on it, and then you're like, I wonder what's for dinner. It's cold. My foot hurts. So then you come back. I'm coming back. Okay, candle flame, candle flame, candle flame. My partner was so mean to me this morning. Candle flame, candle flame, candle flame. I'm tired. Whatever. Right? So coming back. That's dharana. Dhyana is candle flame. That's it. Nothing else. Totally focused. Don't think of pink elephants. You know that joke? Don't think of pink elephants and then you think of them. Dhyana, there's no pink elephants. It's just the candle flame. It's like honey being poured from a container. You know the difference between like honey when it starts to pour, it's just one stream. That's your awareness. That's your consciousness going to that thing, connecting to the candle flame. Samadhi, this last limb, samadhi, is when that concentration, that unification with that candle flame breaks through and you become the candle flame. And through the union of your awareness with that candle flame, suddenly you are one with everything in the universe. So it's breaking through duality and division. Dhyana, there's still me and a candle flame. There's my awareness and there's the thing that I'm focusing on, whatever it is. Samadhi is when there's no more me and it. There's just oneness. So that's an overview of the 8 limbs. I've been talking for a long time. I'll say just briefly that the Yoga Sutras then goes on to describe what happens when you do samyama on all kinds of different stuff. You know, if you do samyama on words, then you eventually, you know, so it talks about what's called siddhis, mastery, powers, magical things. If you practice samyama on words, you can learn the language of everything. If you practice samyama on your samskaras, you become aware of your previous births. If you practice samyama on your body, you can develop invisibility. So it's like kind of all these sutras that one after the other. If you practice samyama on the sun, you can learn, you become the knowledge of all the realms of existence. So it's quite specific. And then it takes a break and says, like, just so you know, all these are distractions. You probably shouldn't really do them. These are outer siddhis, and they're obstacles to samadhi. That's what it says. These are outer siddhis. They're cool. They're very interesting, but they're obstacles to where we're going, which is samadhi. And again, I just want to remind us all that all of this stuff is in service to chitta prasadanam, the purification of the heart mind, so that it is clear and so that we can differentiate between what we are not and what we are, this eternal radiant soul that we are. And so that soul can fully experience this life as it is, and this life is completely bathed in the radiance and glory of that soul. Any barrier between this outer life of manifested reality and the eternal radiant, fearless, harmless, unharmable being that we are, any barrier is removed and we are absolutely free. And there's a whole kind of sequence of things that happen once. So there's the immediate practice of samadhi, which is a temporarily contained thing. You experience samadhi in a time frame. I'm experiencing it now. I'm not telling you that I am, but I'm saying, you know, this kind of oneness consciousness happens. So as one practices with that oneness consciousness over time, again, it develops and becomes more and more subtle, so that eventually one can live in that awareness and it becomes more permanent. And the ultimate state of the Yoga Sutra, the ultimate state that it points to, is called Kaivalya, which is basically like independent, like the Purusha, the soul is completely unified with the embodied life in a way that it's not dependent on anything. You don't have to sit down and close your eyes and do a practice. It's constant and it's totally permanent and it's independent.
You never change not who you are.
You never, yeah, it's not like now I'm with my mom and I'm going to act this way, and now I'm with my friends and I'm going to act this way, and now I'm with this person, I'm going to act this way. It's permanent. The self is permanently established and unchangeable and completely not dependent on any circumstance or any person or any relationship or anything else. It's just entire entire liberation, to be oneself. This is the ultimate state. And it's, there's a kind of a poignant piece at the end which says, kind of once you begin to approach that state, the sanskaras that you're creating are born of that state, and they wipe out all the other karmas. They get rid of all the other ones, and then once all the past karmas are resolved, this rain of grace washes over you, and the rain of grace washes away any remaining impurities. And so that's the last thing. There's all this effort, all this intentionality, all this pursuit of yoga, pursuit of self, pursuit of realization, working, trying, grasping doesn't necessarily need to be grasping, but intentionality. But the last thing that happens is the rain. There's a cloud, the Dharma Megha. I don't know if I have the Sanskrit here, but yeah, this cloud forms and it rains a rain of grace that washes away any remaining impurities. And this happens when we release the attachment to even the higher states of consciousness. So it's, aspiration, 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 surrender. Release attachment to even the higher states of consciousness. Release attachment even to liberation. Release attachment even to realization. Then the rain comes and washes it all away.